Have you ever wondered what happens when the human mind breaks so completely that reality itself becomes unrecognizable? What transforms a musician who sings about peace into someone who claims to receive murderous orders from an invisible force? Today, we're diving deep into the Alvin Taylor case, one of Wisconsin's most chilling true crime stories from the 1980s, where mental illness, delusion, and a devastating murder spree collided in the most tragic way possible. This is the story of the musician killer known as the Force Killer. Before we begin this journey into one of the most disturbing real crime cases in American history, I want to connect with you. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments below. Are you fascinated by true crime investigation and cases that explore the darkest corners of the human psyche? If you're ready to hear the complete killer profile of Alvin Taylor, the story that will challenge everything you think you know about mental illness, crime, and justice, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because we bring you real, deeply researched true crime stories every single week. Now, let me take you back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 1947, where a boy was born into a world that would never show him love. Alvin Taylor came into this world in Milwaukee, a city famous for its breweries and hardworking communities. But young Alvin's home was nothing like the warm, supportive households that surrounded him. His parents were indifferent about raising him, often physically assaulting him, to discipline him, or simply leaving him to wander the streets. Imagine being a small child, beaten by the people who were supposed to protect you, then cast out to walk alone through city streets. The abuse shaped everything about who Alvin would become. His attorney would later describe how the constant beatings caused him to repress his feelings, building up pain, fear, and anger that would eventually manifest in the most terrible ways. But in those early years, despite the violence and neglect, something beautiful emerged from the darkness. The young boy developed a passion for songwriting, meditation, and psychotherapy. Music became Alvin's salvation, his escape from the nightmare of his childhood. He poured his soul into creating songs, finding in melodies what he couldn't find in his family: connection, meaning, and hope. Beginning in the late 1960s, he tried to build a career as a musician and toured across the northeastern United States as a soloist for little-known bands. He was chasing a dream, performing in small venues, hoping that one day his talent would be recognized. But something was wrong inside Alvin's mind, something that no amount of music could fix. Taylor is believed to have experienced his first psychotic break sometime in 1969, after going to a bar and supposedly overhearing that some men were planning to kill him. In his mind, a casual conversation between strangers transformed into a murder conspiracy. Even after he left the bar, the paranoia followed him like a shadow. He believed people on the bus were plotting against him, that the maid at his motel was part of the conspiracy. Everyone wanted him dead. This wasn't just anxiety or fear. This was the beginning of a complete fracture from reality. By the mid-1970s, he began to show signs of mental illness that affected him to the point where he was admitted to a hospital, where he was soon diagnosed with schizophrenia. The doctors gave his suffering a name: paranoid schizophrenia. But a diagnosis couldn't cure the voices that were starting to speak to him, voices that would eventually command him to kill. Life became a cycle of hospitalization and release. Due to this diagnosis, Taylor spent most of the late 1970s until March 1987 in various psychiatric clinics. He would stabilize on medication, get released, then deteriorate again as the voices returned. In 1980, during one of his periods outside the hospital, he was also convicted of delivering crack cocaine in Medford and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. After his release from prison, Alvin returned to the only thing that made sense to him: music. Beginning in the early 1980s, Taylor made a living as a singer and entertainer in nightclubs throughout Wisconsin and Bloomington, Minnesota. He was a nightclub singer from the Twin Cities, traveling between venues, standing under stage lights, singing to crowds who had no idea of the battle raging inside his mind. But his mental health was crumbling faster than anyone realized. Friends and acquaintances alike characterized him as a religious fanatic and pacifist who, by the late 1980s, had virtually become detached from reality and preferred to live in his own fantasy world. Here was the terrible irony. Alvin considered himself a pacifist, someone who opposed all violence, yet something dark was growing inside him. He began hearing what he called the Force. When he was arrested, Taylor stated that as a soldier of God, he was driven to kill by messages he received from the radio and television. In his delusional mind, he had been chosen for a special mission. He described himself as a soldier of God, tasked with killing evil people as an undercover police officer. The voices told him who was evil, who deserved to die, and he believed them completely. In 1984, Alvin met a man who would become his first victim. Robert L. Williams was a 38-year-old computer company employee, a friend he had met in 1984. They spent time together, developed what seemed like a genuine friendship. But inside Alvin's fractured mind, a delusion was forming. He eventually started believing that Williams had killed someone. The Force spoke to Alvin about Robert. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They told him that Robert was a murderer who had to be stopped. On July 15, 1985, this led him to shoot and kill the man with a .357 Magnum. Alvin then buried the body in the backyard of his rented home in Springbrook and covered it with quicklime, a chemical that speeds decomposition. For 2 years, Robert Williams simply vanished. His family searched desperately, filed missing person reports, and prayed for answers. Williams' remains were not found and exhumed until 2 years later, when a man who had rented the farmhouse accidentally came across the burial site and informed the police about it. Imagine the horror of discovering a grave in your backyard. The shock of realizing you'd been living steps away from someone's final resting place. But Alvin wasn't finished. He continued his life as a traveling musician, performing in clubs, and listening to The Force. In 1986, he was living in an apartment in Eau Claire with a neighbor named James Severson. James was 42 years old, living a quiet life, completely unaware that the man next door was hearing voices that would soon target him. He later stated that he had stabbed Severson in the neck during the attack, but the blade broke upon impact, whereupon the pair engaged in a fierce struggle. Can you imagine the terror? The confusion as your neighbor attacks you, the desperate fight for survival as the knife breaks. Taylor eventually managed to choke Severson out, after which he took a butcher knife from a kitchen drawer and stabbed him several more times, killing him. A foul odor later led Eau Claire police to a blood-drenched apartment where they found Severson with a knife blade broken off and stuck in his neck, as well as multiple stab wounds on his body, inflicted with a butcher knife. That fall, something remarkable happened in Eau Claire. Taylor attended the Peace Child musical in Eau Claire, whose goal was to improve relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. Here was a man who had just brutally murdered someone, attending a performance about peace and understanding. The contradiction didn't register in his delusional mind. He was still convinced he was doing God's work, eliminating evil from the world. While working there, he befriended 27-year-old Timothy Hayden, a custodian for University of Wisconsin-Stout, who later moved in to live with him at his rented apartment in Menomonee. Timothy was young, hardworking, and kind. He and Alvin became close enough that Timothy decided to share an apartment with him. It seemed like a friendship, but for Alvin, reality and delusion were completely intertwined. One day, Alvin noticed a calendar hanging in their apartment. On it was a picture of a female model. After seeing the female model on a calendar that reminded him of Hayden's estranged girlfriend, Taylor started to believe that Hayden had planned to hurt her using a gun he had recently purchased. In his delusional mind, the pieces fit together perfectly. The woman looked like Timothy's ex. Timothy had a gun. Therefore, Timothy must be planning to murder her. The force spoke to Alvin again, commanding him to act. On March 28, Taylor confessed that he drove to Hayden's residence in Menomonee early in the morning of March 26. After being invited in, Taylor snuck up behind Hayden and shot him several times in the head with a .22 handgun. Hayden was found in his home lying dead in a pool of blood. But this time, the killing would be Alvin's undoing. During the course of the investigation, police determined that the shell casings matched the Williams crime scene, and after interrogating some witnesses, they learned that Taylor had sold such a gun to a man not too long ago. The forensic evidence was connecting the dots. The same weapon, the same killer. The pair were acquainted, as Taylor lived for a time at the Paradise and Village Motel and Chinese restaurant, where Lundgren was the manager. The latter was killed because he wanted Taylor to leave. It was that simple, in Alvin's delusional mind. Daniel asked him to move out, so Daniel had to die. What made this case particularly horrifying was what happened after the shooting. Lundgren, the manager of the Paradise Village and Motel and Chinese restaurant, was found in his crashed car on November 29, 1986, on a rural road near his West Bend home, about 30 miles north of Milwaukee. Initially, it was believed that the victim died from injuries sustained in a car accident, as his car had crashed into a culvert. But even that wasn't the end of Alvin's confessions. Taylor claimed that he had attempted to kill a man named Paul Zwick at the same motel on December 23, 1986, by striking him with a hammer and stabbing him with a screwdriver. Investigators tracked Paul down and interviewed him. Zwick was later located and, after cooperating with investigators, corroborated Taylor's testimony. He claimed that he had not reported the crime because he enlisted in the Navy and was forced to leave Wisconsin a few days after it had occurred. Paul Zwick had survived a brutal attack, left Wisconsin to start a new life in the Navy, and probably never expected to be contacted years later about the man who tried to kill him. Now came the question that would define the rest of Alvin Taylor's life. Was he legally sane when he committed these murders? Taylor admitted to the 4 murders shortly after his arrest, but his sanity was quickly questioned. Anyone who spoke with him could tell something was profoundly wrong. He claimed to hear voices projected by what he called the Force and described himself as a soldier of God tasked with killing evil people as an undercover police officer. In addition, he suffered from hypochondria and clinical delusions. His grip on reality was completely shattered. He seemingly expressed regret for what he had done and stated that he knew he was likely going to prison. There were glimpses of awareness, moments where Alvin seemed to understand the gravity of his actions. But those moments were fleeting, overwhelmed by his delusions. His attorney, John Kaczynski, requested a mental health evaluation. Psychiatrists examined Alvin extensively. At said exam, Taylor was found to be suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and deemed incompetent to stand trial for the murder charges. He couldn't assist in his own defense because he couldn't distinguish between reality and his delusions. Kaczynski later told in an interview with the media that his client suffered from a severe mental illness, and that communication with him during the trial was impossible, noting that he had never encountered such a case before in his legal practice. Think about what this means. Alvin Taylor had confessed to 4 murders. The evidence was overwhelming. But he would never stand trial for those crimes because his mind was too broken to participate in his own defense. He was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment on the attempted murder charge of Paul Zupic, the only case where he was deemed competent to face justice. On June 2nd, the court ordered that he be interned at the Mendota Mental Health Institution in Madison. This wasn't a prison sentence with a fixed end date. Alvin would remain there indefinitely, until he could be deemed competent to stand trial or no longer a danger to society. For someone with his severe mental illness, that day might never come. Years turned into decades at Mendota. After spending more than 17 years in a psychiatric facility, Taylor asked the Dunn County Court in 2005 to release him, but his request was denied. 5 years later, he filed a second petition, but was again denied. In February 2013, he tried yet again, with his attorney arguing that he should not be considered a danger as he had never been violent during his internment. It was a compelling argument. In 25 years at Mendota, Alvin had never hurt anyone. Surely that proved he was no longer dangerous. But the facility staff objected, claiming that Taylor was a high-risk patient and had never been transferred to a halfway house. A number of the staff testified that his mental state was too unstable and that he had a propensity to attempt escapes, as he was repeatedly seen checking doors for access to neighboring rooms and clinic buildings. The behavior suggested he was planning something, testing the security, looking for a way out. As a result of this testimony, his third request was also denied. In the fall of 2015, the now 68-year-old Taylor was examined by a special medical board to ascertain his mental state. They concluded that he had improved remarkably. Perhaps, after all these years, the medications and therapy were finally working, at which point they filed a petition with the Washington County Court of Common Pleas. As a result, he remains at a psychiatric facility and is still undergoing treatment to this day. Alvin Taylor is now in his late 70s, an old man who has spent most of his adult life behind locked doors, neither free nor imprisoned in the traditional sense. He exists in a legal and psychological limbo, too mentally ill to stand trial, too dangerous to release. This is the story of Alvin Taylor, musician killer turned serial murderer, the delusional killer whose paranoid schizophrenia and belief in the force led to the deaths of 4 innocent people across Wisconsin. The Alvin Taylor murders remain one of the most complex cases in true crime history, where USA murders intersected with severe mental illness to create a tragedy that continues to raise difficult questions about justice, accountability, and the treatment of the criminally insane. And what about Alvin himself? Is he a monster or a victim? The answer is complicated. He committed terrible acts, ended innocent lives based on delusions that existed only in his mind. But he is also someone whose severe mental illness destroyed not just his victims' lives but his own. His attorney pointed out that during his 25 years at Mendota, Taylor has not gotten into any fights or exhibited violent behavior of any kind. Without the voices, without the force commanding him to kill, Alvin is not violent. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Where does justice lie when mental illness is this severe? How do we balance accountability with compassion? What responsibility does society have to people like Alvin, whose childhood abuse and untreated mental illness created a perfect storm of tragedy? These questions don't have easy answers. What we can say is that Alvin Taylor's case represents a failure on multiple levels. A failure of his family to provide love and safety. A failure of the mental health system in the 70s and 80s to adequately treat his schizophrenia. A failure that resulted in 4 deaths and decades of institutionalization. So what do you think about the Alvin Taylor case? Does severe mental illness excuse crimes like the 1980s murders he committed? Should this delusional killer ever be released, or should he remain institutionalized for the rest of his life? The question of how we handle mental illness crime continues to challenge our justice system. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This is one of those true crime cases where reasonable people can disagree, and I genuinely want to hear your perspective on this killer profile. If this deep dive into the Alvin Taylor murders, one of Wisconsin's most complex real crime cases from the 1980s, affected you, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who's interested in true crime investigation and the psychology behind these devastating murder sprees. Your support means everything and helps us continue bringing you these thoroughly researched investigations into cases that challenge our understanding of crime, punishment, paranoid schizophrenia, and mental illness. And if you want more stories like this, stories that explore not just what happened, but why it happened, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. We have so many more incredible cases to share with you, cases that will make you think, question, and see the world differently. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.